So today we're going to jump into Chapter 4, Descriptive Methods in Research. We're going to look at several different types of descriptive methods and weigh the pros and cons of each. So let's imagine that you're in a public place, and this example is set in the White House, and you hear or see, or maybe both, a child throwing a tantrum. Think about what the parents are doing. Think about what the other bystanders are doing. Are the parents' actions affected by the attention of others? Well, this is an example of the first type of descriptive methods in research that we're going to discuss today, the observational method, and the things we need to take into consideration if we decide to use that method of collecting data. So, weighing out the pros and cons of each. So, in general, the goal of descriptive research methods is to describe behavior, the what questions. And there's three types that we're going to discuss in this lecture. We have observational, qualitative, and survey methods. So observational methods are up first. And let's think back to the tantrum example. In this situation, you're simply making observations of human or animal behavior. That's it. No intervention, no manipulation, just observing behavior. So this is a good method for describing behavior, but there are a few cons we must consider. You can't really make predictions using this method. You can't make any cause and effect claims, and you can't answer any of the why questions, simply the what questions. But the observational method can be very accurate in describing behavior, and it can open the door for more or new research topics based on observing natural behaviors. Now, there are two types of observational methods that we'll talk about today. First, we have laboratory observation, and this setup allows for a little more control than what we'll talk about next. And you can focus on a small number of predefined behaviors. So perhaps you want to observe how students interact during a study session. You can predetermine what types of behaviors you want to define, so maybe helpful behaviors like being focused, attentive, responding to others. Maybe you want to look for unhelpful behaviors, and you qualify that as unfocused, or a student being inattentive, or just listening to others. And maybe you even have parameters in place for determining if a student is being distracting during the session. So something like playing on their phone, falling asleep, making jokes, getting off topic. You could observe all of these things without any intervention and collect data pretty accurately. Now, next we have naturalistic observation, and this would simply be observing in a natural environment. So maybe you want to see how children interact at a playground. You can observe sharing behaviors, interactions, those types of things in a more natural setting, the playground, without any type of intervention. Now, this method is high in what we call ecological validity. So what is ecological validity and why is it important? Well, this is the degree to which behaviors are observed or recorded in a study reflect the behaviors that actually occur in natural settings, right? We want our research to reflect real life, the true nature of human behavior. And this is where there's a trade-off between naturalistic observation and laboratory observation. So let's think about the pros and cons of the two types of observational methods that we just discussed. So laboratory observations give us a higher level of control, right? We can control the setting, how many people are being observed, those types of things. But it has less ecological validity. If the subjects in the lab know they're being studied, do you think this could alter their behavior, or do you think that they'll respond differently? Think back to the study group example. Maybe the students would be on their best studying behavior, knowing that you're observing their study group interactions. Is this technically ecologically valid? They could act completely different in a natural setting outside of the lab, and you wouldn't really know how to tell the difference. Now, the naturalistic observation method gives us more ecological validity, but again, there's a trade-off here with having less control. You can't control things in a natural setting, which makes observing behaviors more complex and more complicated. Now, there are a couple options to increase control and ecological validity in observational methods. You can use undisguised observation, where subjects know they're being observed, or you can use disguised observation, where your subjects do not know that they're being observed. And this requires some deception, which relates back to our ethics lecture. The researcher may have to hide or record participants unknowingly and then debrief them later, letting them know that their behavior was recorded. You can also have situations where the researcher participates with the subjects, so they may actively interact with them at certain points in the study. So, in the example with the kids sharing at the park, the researcher may hand a new or high value toy to one child and observe the behaviors that follow of that child and the other children playing at the park. Or you can have non participant observation, which is more like the study group example, where the researcher is just watching and not really interacting with the subjects. So, again, there are a few major issues with the observational method of research. First, you're going to have reactivity. So, your subjects may react to the researcher or knowing that they are being observed, like the study group example. Students may be on their absolute best behavior because they know they're being watched. You also have things like expectancy effects. Again, you may see students going above and beyond during the study session to impress the researcher because they figured out what's going on. And you can also have expectancy effects which affect the researcher's expectations of the outcome of the study, which can lead to the issue of confirmation bias on the part of the researcher. So if a researcher has certain expectations, like a child with a new toy will not share or not share well, they may be more predetermined to see that behavior and ignore or not be mindful of other behaviors that are going on. So almost putting on blinders, if you will, and trying to confirm their own bias. A few other problems to note of the observational methods are that they're very costly and they take a lot of time. When we do research, we want it to be effective and efficient, and observational methods are not always the best way to achieve that goal. Now, ask yourself this question: is it ethical for researchers to observe the behavior of others? Why or why not? So just take a second and think about it. This question comes up a lot when we are talking about researchers hiding, not interacting, or recording people without their knowledge. But the observational methods can be perfectly ethical if it's done correctly. Participants can, of course, be at no risk or no harm, and the researchers must follow the ethical guidelines set by the IRB and obtain IRB approval for their studies, just as if they were going to have someone come into the lab and do a true experiment. Now we're going to talk about qualitative methods. So quantitative, on the other hand, is a more top-down, hypothesis-driven approach. Qualitative is a hallmark of observational methods. It's more bottom-up. So natural settings or unstructured interviews take place. There's less control. And this unstructured setup allows us to go where the subject goes, right? Take us where the research is leading, and we can change what's being observed. So you may set out to research things like sharing behaviors on the playground. However, halfway through your study, you're seeing that sharing is not really maybe the focus of these children. Perhaps it's play groups and interactions. Perhaps it's being inclusive or bullying, things like that. And you can kind of change what you want to observe. Now, qualitative methods, they typically involve less use of statistics. And coding systems are used to describe behavior types. So think back to the study group situation. So perhaps every time someone has a helpful behavior, you mark that. And someone gets 7, helpful behaviors and 3 unhelpful behaviors and no disruptive behaviors. Now, is this flexibility of how we can code and collect data, kind of leading us where the research goes, is that a strength or a weakness or both? Well, like many things in research, you'll come to find out it's both. So, this strength really does allow us to, again, follow the research, go where it takes us, kind of take a participant lead, if you will. But it's also a weakness because it limits the use of statistics and the conclusions that we're able to draw about our research findings. So let's take a look at an example. This is the second type of observational methods that we're going to look at today. The second type of descriptive methods that we're going to look at today, which is interviews. So this is a verbal equivalent to a survey, right? And they vary in formality. So it may be a standardized interview, a semi-standardized interview, or an unstandardized interview. So with standardized, we'd stick to a specific set of questions, try to limit anything outside the scope of those questions being discussed, and stick to the script. Semi-standardized may allow for a little bit more interpretation, a little bit more elaboration from our participants. And unstandard is exactly what it sounds like. So you may have a couple questions that you're trying to follow, but more so you're just trying to collect information from your participant and allow them to express their views or beliefs or behaviors however they see fit. So there's some order here. They're pretty easy and non-threatening, right? That's a really good way to describe validation in our study. But you also have the benefit of facial cues when you're doing interviews with participants. Now, qualitative data analysis is a little bit more tricky. So we organize our data into categories. We're looking for patterns, right? Now, what scale of measurement is this? Think back to a couple lectures ago. Well, this is nominal data. So different statistics are used for this analysis, right? And the data are usually extensive notes, right? So we don't have just a ton of numbers. No one's going to answer you by saying, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You're going to have to take the words, the notes, the vernacular that was used and transform that into categories and nominal data that you can run statistics on. Now, this greatly restricts the kind of statistics that you can use because there's less properties of measurement. So remember, there's a hierarchy there. The more properties of measurement you have, the more freedom you have to run analyses with your data. However, nominal data doesn't give us a lot of wiggle room, and there's a very strict set of analyses that we can use with nominal data. So here's just kind of a small example, and don't let this, load you down too much. But if you look right here, hopefully you can see my cursor, in this box with all the words in it. So that is someone's interview with a researcher, right? So you can see here that there's a lot of text, right? So the participant gives you several sentences to your question, right? What you would need to do is go through and code for different types of things. So in that right-hand box with the color codes to the right, you can see that there are different codes, right? So seeing someone like me, not attending to people like me, paying attention to what people are doing or saying. Each one of those codes will be qualitative in the way that you categorize them and eventually turn that into a nominal data set in which you can run statistics appropriate for nominal data on. Now, in a similar vein, the third one that we're going to talk about today is constructing a survey, so survey methods. Now, survey methods have a lot of variability. They can be open, closed, partially closed, all different types of questions. They can be Likert ratings, so statements, numbers anchored with words. We've talked about those before when we were talking about the different types of data. So as you can see, what was your reason for contacting customer service? And you can give people, multiple options to answer and then even give them the opportunity to write in their own response. Or at the bottom, you see the Likert scale, which allows them to be, on a certain level of agreement with the statement or remain undecided. Now, there are advantages of open-ended questions, greater variety, but it does take a whole lot more time coding. So just like we looked at with the interview method, we have to take those words and turn them into a coding system. Anytime you ask a participant an open-ended question on a survey like this, you have to do the same thing. Now, there are advantages of close-ended and Likert ratings, so they're pretty easy to analyze statistically. Kind of put in short, the data are good to go, especially if you're already using a number scale, right? So if you ask someone, to rate on a scale of 1 to 7 or 1 to 10, their ratings are already qualitative in that they're a numerical value you can just kind of pick up and run with. There's no further coding that's really needed. Now, there are a few potential problems with survey methods. So first we have things like loaded questions. So let's look at the top example. Do you know that your political views are destructive to this country? No, I mean, yes, well, actually. Why do I feel like I've been set up? Whether I answer yes or no, I am conceding that my political views are destructive to this country. So as you can see, the way that the first monkey asked that question is completely loaded. There's no real way for the second monkey to answer that question without, like they said, conceding that their political views are destructive to this country. We also have things like leading questions. So, welcome to Bananarama. Hello, would you like to buy a banana? It's not a very interesting product, sorry. Welcome to Bananarama. How excited are you about purchasing a fantastic banana? Quite excited. Very good. So you can see in the bottom example, the little red guy kind of led the green guy into buying a banana, even though it's not really an exciting product. Now, those are just some, kind of funny cartoon examples. But there are real life examples where this is an issue. So we also have issues like double-barreled questions, right? So take a look at the top example. You may receive a question like, how satisfied are you with the check-in and the checkout process? Well, this is a little tricky, right? What if you were very satisfied with the check-in process, but very dissatisfied with the checkout process? How would you answer this question? Participants may stick somewhere in the middle. They may only answer about one. They could skip the question altogether. And it's really impossible to kind of pick apart how they were truly feeling when they answered this question. And you also have things like response bias. So if you look at the bottom example, you see that these questions are a lot of I questions, right? I feel, I am, I take. These types of questions are tricky because participants will often respond in a way that they want to be seen, right? So you may not want to admit some things about yourself, or perhaps you want to answer in a way that you think the researcher wants you to answer, right? So I'm able to do things as well as most other people. You may strongly agree with that statement on paper, but may only agree or maybe even slightly disagree with it in real life. And that's the problem with survey methods and response bias. Now, the last thing that we're going to talk about is sampling techniques, and this is really important. So random sampling is where each member of the population is equally likely to be chosen as part of the sample, right? And that seems pretty, elementary. Of course, that's what we want to do, but it's a little tricky, right? So you want to use sampling techniques that allow us to get a population sample that is representative of just that, the population. So typically we use stratified random sampling. So this is sampling randomly within different subgroups of the population, and that's where the strata comes from. And this helps guarantee that the sample represents the specific population on specific characteristics. So as you can see in the little illustration, you have these groups of people that are representative by their little, hexagons and their colors. And if we wanted to do stratified random sampling, we would randomly select one person or two people from each one of these little groups. And that would give us a pretty representative sample of the entire population, right? So here's a stratified random sample example. So as you can see, we have different breakdowns of Memphis, Shelby County, Tennessee, and the United States. And these are different races that are representative by the colors in the bars. And within the United States, compared to Memphis, we see that the race of Black is a lot more prominent, right? So, if we were to sample Memphis and want to relate back to the United States, we would want to make sure that we weren't weighing too heavily within one race. We'd want to try to keep it as equal as possible so that we can relate that back to the general population, not just our city, right? So another sampling technique is called convenience sampling. This is used a lot. So the catch as you can sampling technique. So this is done pretty bluntly with the SONA studies in the introductory to psych classes and even the SONA studies that you will participate in this semester. So as researchers, we have to be able to use certain techniques to collect our data. Like I said, research can get very costly. And it can be very difficult. So using something like SONA is very convenient and helps keep our costs down by being able to give participants course credit versus actually paying them to participate in research. So convenient sampling is where we would, take from the sample that is at hand and try our best to get a random representative sample that way. So that is wrapping up our Chapter 4 Descriptive Methods lecture. If you have any questions, as always, reach out or set up office hours with me. And if not, then I'll see you next week for the Chapter 5 lecture.